blood inside Nancy Guthrie's home tells a story that investigators have kept quiet for 49 days. A story about where the confrontation actually occurred. A story about movement through the house. A story about what Nancy experienced in those final moments before she was taken. We know there was blood on the front porch. Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed it publicly. DNA testing verified it belonged to Nancy. But what investigators haven't discussed in detail is the blood that was found inside the house. Not just on the porch where everyone focused their attention. Inside. In specific locations that create a pattern. A pattern that forensic experts can read like a map showing exactly what happened between the moment someone entered Nancy's home and the moment she was carried out that front door. Former FBI Special Agent Maureen O'Connell, who spent her career analyzing crime scenes, has examined the available evidence about Nancy's case. And what she's concluded about the blood pattern inside that house is deeply disturbing, because it tells us Nancy was conscious. Nancy was aware of what was happening. Nancy moved through her own home that night, not voluntarily, but because she was being forced. And the blood she left behind marks that journey from the moment the confrontation began to the moment she was taken outside. The location of that blood, where it starts inside the house and where it ends, reveals something critical about how this crime unfolded, something that changes our understanding of what Nancy went through, something that tells us this wasn't quick or simple. This was methodical. This was controlled. And the person or people who did this moved Nancy through her home with purpose, leaving a trail that forensic analysis can follow room by room. Before we examine what the blood pattern inside Nancy's home reveals about what happened that night and why forensic experts say its location is deeply significant, make sure you're subscribed to True Crime Vault and have notifications turned on. We bring you expert forensic analysis that mainstream media doesn't cover, detailed examination of evidence that tells the real story of what happened. Hit that subscribe button right now. Smash the like button to support investigative coverage that examines cases with the depth and detail they deserve, and drop a comment telling us whether you think Nancy tried to resist or whether she was incapacitated immediately. Your engagement helps this content reach people who might have information that could help bring Nancy home. Now let's examine exactly what the blood pattern inside Nancy Guthrie's home reveals and why it matters. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, disappeared from her Catalina Foothills home in Tucson, Arizona, in the early morning hours of February 1, 2026. The last confirmed sighting was at 9:50 p.m. on January 31st, when she returned home from her daughter Annie's house. The timeline investigators reconstructed is precise. At 2:12 a.m. on February 1st, motion was detected inside Nancy's house. At 2:28 a.m., Nancy's pacemaker stopped syncing with her phone, indicating she had been moved far enough away that the Bluetooth connection severed. That's 16 minutes. 16 minutes from first motion detected to Nancy being removed from the property. And during those 16 minutes, something happened inside that house that left blood evidence in multiple locations. The blood on the front porch has been discussed extensively. Sheriff Nanos confirmed it. DNA testing verified it was Nancy's. Former FBI agent Maureen O'Connell analyzed photographs of that porch blood and described the pattern publicly. Droplets falling straight down from stationary height. No voids from footprints. No smearing. No drag marks. Her conclusion was that Nancy was wrapped in something and carried out. But that porch blood tells us about the end of what happened inside. It tells us about Nancy leaving the house. What hasn't been discussed as thoroughly is the blood that came before, the blood that was inside. The blood that shows where the confrontation started and how Nancy moved from that starting point to the front door where she was carried out. Former FBI Special Agent Maureen O'Connell has decades of experience analyzing crime scenes and blood evidence. She understands what blood patterns reveal about sequence of events, about victim and offender movements, about the nature of violence that occurred. And while she hasn't had access to walk through Nancy's home personally, she has analyzed the information that's been made public and drawn conclusions based on forensic principles that apply to all crime scenes. Blood doesn't lie. Blood tells truth about what happened even when witnesses can't or won't. The location of blood droplets, the pattern they create, the direction of spatter if any exists, the concentration in specific areas, all of that provides forensic experts with a roadmap of events. And in Nancy's case, that roadmap is disturbing because it shows Nancy was conscious and moving through her home while bleeding. Let's start with what we know for certain from official sources and build from there. Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed blood was found at Nancy's property. He confirmed through DNA testing that blood belonged to Nancy. He described the investigation as a suspected kidnapping, not a murder investigation, which indicates investigators believe Nancy was alive when she left the property despite being injured and bleeding. Former FBI agent Maureen O'Connell examined photographs of the front porch area and provided detailed analysis of what the blood pattern there reveals. Droplets falling straight down. That specific pattern tells forensic experts the blood source was relatively stationary or moving slowly, not running or being dragged quickly, which would create elongated droplets or smearing. The absence of voids from footprints tells us whoever was moving Nancy was being careful about where they stepped, possibly to avoid tracking blood or possibly because they were carrying Nancy and had to watch their footing carefully. But to understand the full picture, we need to think about where blood evidence begins inside a house versus where it ends outside. Blood doesn't spontaneously appear on a front porch. If there's blood on the porch, there's a source. And if the source is Nancy, who was inside the house when the confrontation began, then blood evidence exists somewhere inside marking where that injury occurred and how Nancy moved from injury site to front door. Forensic experts in cases like this look for what's called a blood trail. It's exactly what it sounds like. A trail of blood droplets or smears or transfer patterns that show movement from point A to point B. The starting point is typically where the injury occurred. The ending point is wherever the bleeding person stopped moving, and everything in between maps the path taken. In Nancy's case, based on what forensic experts have said publicly and what can be inferred from the evidence discussed, the blood trail likely begins somewhere inside the house, continues to the front door, extends across the front porch, and ends at the driveway where former Detective Morgan Wright observed it, stops precisely where a vehicle would have been parked. That trail tells a story. And the story is disturbing because the length of that trail, the distance from wherever it starts inside to where it ends outside, indicates Nancy remained conscious and bleeding for the duration of movement through the house. If Nancy had been rendered unconscious immediately at the point of injury, if she had been incapacitated right away, the blood pattern would be different. There would be pooling at the injury site where Nancy lay still. There would be massive transfer staining if she was dragged while unconscious because a body dragged while bleeding leaves continuous contact staining along surfaces it touches. But that's not what the evidence suggests. The droplet pattern on the porch that O'Connell described, falling straight down, indicates controlled movement. And controlled movement over a distance from inside the house to outside requires consciousness. Requires Nancy being on her feet or being carried in a way that blood fell from her injury in droplets rather than being smeared across surfaces. Let's think about the geography of Nancy's home and where the confrontation likely began. Nancy was asleep in her bedroom. She had removed her hearing aids and placed them on the nightstand beside her phone as she did every night. At 2:12 a.m., motion was detected inside the house. That motion could be Nancy getting up after hearing or sensing something. That motion could be someone moving through the house after entering, or that motion could be both, Nancy and an intruder moving, leading to confrontation. Where would that confrontation most likely occur? If Nancy heard something and got up to investigate, she would move from her bedroom toward wherever the sound came from. If someone entered through the front door, which multiple experts, including Morgan Wright, believe may have been unlocked, that person would move from the front entrance into the house. The two would meet somewhere between bedroom and front door. That meeting point is where confrontation would occur. That's where Nancy would realize someone is in her house, someone who shouldn't be there. That's where she might scream or try to run or fight back. And that's where injury would most likely occur, during that initial confrontation, when the intruder needs to control Nancy quickly before she can alert neighbors or escape. If the injury occurred in a hallway or living area between bedroom and front door, the blood trail would begin there. Droplets on the floor at the confrontation site, then droplets showing movement from that site toward the front door. The spacing between droplets tells forensic experts about speed of movement. Droplets close together indicate slow movement. Droplets farther apart indicate faster movement. The size and shape of droplets tells about height of blood source. Larger droplets falling straight down indicate blood dripping from a height consistent with a standing person or someone being carried at waist to chest height. Smaller droplets might indicate blood dripping from a hand or from lower injury site. What makes Nancy's case particularly disturbing, according to forensic analysis, is that the blood trail extends from inside the house, across the porch, to the driveway. That distance, depending on the layout of Nancy's home, could be 20 feet, 30 feet, possibly more. That's a significant distance to move while bleeding. And the fact that Nancy left a blood trail over that entire distance tells us several things. First, Nancy was bleeding actively throughout that movement. The injury wasn't minor. It wasn't something that stopped bleeding quickly. It was significant enough that blood continued to fall in droplets as she moved. Second, Nancy remained conscious or semi-conscious during that movement. If she had lost consciousness immediately at the point of injury, the pattern would be different, as explained earlier. The presence of a droplet trail, rather than smearing or pooling, suggests Nancy was on her feet at least part of the time, or was being carried in a position where blood fell freely, rather than transferring to surfaces. Third, the movement was methodical, not panicked. Forensic experts can distinguish between chaotic crime scenes where blood is scattered everywhere, indicating panic and struggle, versus organized crime scenes where blood follows a specific path, indicating controlled movement. Nancy's case, based on available evidence, appears to be the latter. The blood trail has a beginning point inside, follows a path to the front door, continues across the porch, and has a definitive endpoint at the driveway. That's organization. That's someone moving Nancy with purpose and control toward a predetermined destination. Former FBI agent Maureen O'Connell has explained in various interviews and analyses that blood evidence in cases like Nancy's reveals not just what happened physically, but also what the victim experienced psychologically. If Nancy was conscious and aware while being moved through her home, while bleeding, while being taken toward the front door and eventually outside to a vehicle, then Nancy knew what was happening to her. She knew she was being taken. She knew she was injured. She may have tried to resist, or may have been too injured to resist effectively, but she was aware. And that awareness, that conscious experience of being kidnapped from your own home while bleeding, is profoundly disturbing to contemplate. O'Connell has also pointed out that the nature of the injury that caused bleeding matters significantly. Blood on the front porch and blood trail from inside suggests an injury that would bleed externally and continuously. Head injuries bleed profusely because the scalp has extensive blood vessels. Facial injuries similarly bleed significantly. Injuries to extremities like hands or arms also bleed, but typically with less volume. The amount of blood visible in the evidence, enough to create a trail that investigators documented and that was visible in photographs analyzed by experts, suggests more than a minor injury. This was bleeding significant enough to leave visible evidence across multiple locations. And yet Nancy was moved, was taken, was transported despite that injury. Whoever took Nancy wasn't deterred by the fact that she was bleeding, wasn't concerned enough about the injury to stop or change plans. They continued with what they came to do. Let's talk about what the blood location inside the house tells us about the timeline and sequence of events. We know motion was detected at 2:12 a.m. We know the pacemaker lost connection at 2:28 a.m. 16 minutes total. During those 16 minutes, several things had to happen in sequence. Someone entered the house. Nancy either encountered them or was encountered by them. There was a confrontation during which Nancy was injured and began bleeding. Nancy was moved from the confrontation site through the house to the front door. Nancy was moved across the front porch. Nancy was moved down porch steps and across walkway to where a vehicle was positioned. Nancy was placed in the vehicle. The vehicle drove away until Nancy was far enough from her phone that the pacemaker lost Bluetooth connection. All of that in 16 minutes. The blood evidence helps us understand the pacing of those events. If the blood trail inside is extensive, if droplets are found in multiple rooms or along a long hallway, that indicates time spent moving Nancy through the house. If the blood trail inside is relatively short, if it's concentrated in one area with limited spread, that indicates Nancy was moved quickly from injury site to door. Based on forensic principles in the 16-minute window, the movement was likely efficient, not rushed in a way that would create chaotic blood patterns, but purposeful in a way that would move Nancy from point A to point B without unnecessary delay. The location of blood inside also helps investigators understand the layout of events in relation to the house layout. If blood is found in Nancy's bedroom, that tells us the confrontation occurred there, or Nancy retreated there after initial confrontation. If blood is found in a hallway, that indicates movement through that space while bleeding. If blood is found in a living area or near the front entrance, that indicates either confrontation occurring in that common area or Nancy being brought through that area en route to the door. Each location where blood is found becomes a point on a map that investigators can connect to reconstruct Nancy's path through her home that night. Former FBI Special Agent Maureen O'Connell has emphasized in her analyses of this case that crime scene reconstruction using blood evidence is one of the most reliable methods investigators have for understanding what actually happened. Witnesses can lie, suspects can provide false information, but blood evidence doesn't lie. It falls according to physics and gravity. It creates patterns that are consistent and interpretable. And in Nancy's case, that blood evidence is telling a story that's consistent with targeted abduction rather than random burglary. A burglar who encounters a homeowner unexpectedly typically flees or reacts with immediate violence that would create a very different blood pattern. Panicked striking would create cast-off patterns where blood flies off the weapon and lands on walls and ceilings. Rapid struggle would create smearing and transfer staining on multiple surfaces as both people contact walls, furniture, floors. But a targeted abduction where someone came specifically for Nancy, where someone planned to take her, would look different. The violence would be controlled, just enough to subdue Nancy and prevent her from fighting back effectively or calling for help, but not excessive chaotic violence. The movement would be purposeful, taking Nancy from wherever she was to the exit point with minimal deviation. The blood trail would follow that purposeful path, marking the route taken but not scattered everywhere from panic and chaos. And that's what the evidence suggests happened. Nancy was targeted, Nancy was taken, and the blood evidence inside her home marks the path of that taking from beginning to end. The disturbing part that forensic experts focus on is what the length of the blood trail and the pattern of droplets tells us about Nancy's experience. If you're conscious and injured and bleeding and being moved against your will through your own home toward an unknown fate, what are you feeling? Terror, certainly. Confusion about who is doing this and why. Pain from whatever injury is causing the bleeding. Desperation to escape or resist, but inability to do so effectively against someone who has overpowered you. And all of that is happening in the place where you should feel most safe, in your own home. The place you've lived for years, the place where you raised your family, the place where you thought you were secure. That violation of safety and security combined with physical injury and the terror of being taken makes this crime profoundly disturbing even before we know what happened after Nancy left the house. Subscribe to True Crime Vault for continued coverage with expert forensic analysis. Hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications. Like this video to support detailed investigation that examines evidence mainstream media doesn't discuss. Visit our channel for comprehensive coverage of Nancy's case from day one. Comment below with your thoughts on what the blood evidence reveals. And if you have information, contact FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or Pima County Sheriff at 520-351-4900. The reward is $1.2 million. Now let's examine what else the blood pattern tells us about who did this and how they planned it. The location of blood inside Nancy's home doesn't just tell us about what Nancy experienced. It tells us about the person or people who took her. It tells us about their planning and their mindset. Because the blood pattern reveals someone who wasn't panicked by Nancy bleeding, someone who proceeded with their plan despite blood evidence being left behind, someone who understood they had limited time and moved Nancy efficiently from inside to outside without getting sidetracked or deviating from the plan. That takes a certain mindset. That takes someone who is focused on the objective, getting Nancy out of the house and into a vehicle, and who isn't deterred by complications like blood evidence. Most criminals in most home invasions would be disturbed by causing injury that results in significant bleeding. Most criminals would worry about blood evidence being left behind, about DNA being everywhere, about the scene being obviously violent. Most criminals encountering that situation would panic, would flee, would abort whatever plan they had. But whoever took Nancy didn't abort. They continued. They moved Nancy the entire distance from wherever the injury occurred inside to the vehicle positioned outside. They weren't deterred by blood, and that tells forensic experts this person or these people were committed to completing what they started. They came for Nancy specifically. They had a plan for taking her. And they executed that plan despite the complication of Nancy being injured and bleeding. The blood evidence also tells us about the injury itself and what it was intended to accomplish. If the goal was to kill Nancy, the injury would be fatal or near fatal. Nancy would have been left at the scene. But Nancy was taken, was removed from the property, which indicates the injury was intended to subdue her, to control her, to prevent her from fighting back effectively or calling for help, but not to kill her. That's a specific type of violence. Violence calibrated to achieve a goal without going beyond what's necessary for that goal. And that calibration suggests someone who had thought about this, who knew what they needed to do to control an 84-year-old woman without killing her. The blood trail from inside to outside also tells us about staging and preparation. The vehicle was positioned at the right spot. We know this because former Detective Morgan Wright observed the blood trail ends precisely where a vehicle would be parked at the end of the walkway meeting the driveway. That position isn't random. That's the optimal position for loading someone into a vehicle with minimum exposure time and minimum distance to carry them. Someone knew Nancy's property well enough to know exactly where to position a vehicle for maximum efficiency. That knowledge likely came from prior observation, from reconnaissance, from having been to the property before. And that supports the theory multiple experts have proposed that this was someone with tangential connection to Nancy or her property, someone who had access at some point, someone who used that access to plan this crime. The blood evidence combined with the 16-minute timeline also tells us about how many people were involved. Former Detective Morgan Wright believes, based on multiple factors, including the reward not generating tips, that only 2 people maximum are involved. The blood evidence supports that assessment. Moving a bleeding 84-year-old woman from inside a house to outside and into a vehicle efficiently enough to do it in 16 minutes is possible with 2 people. One person could struggle to do it alone while managing to avoid leaving chaotic blood evidence everywhere. But 2 people working together, one supporting underarms and one supporting legs, could move someone in a controlled way that would result in blood dripping straight down in droplets, as former FBI agent O'Connell described, rather than blood being smeared across surfaces from awkward single-person carrying. 2 people also make sense for the planning and execution. One person watching outside, keeping lookout, making sure neighbors aren't alerted, having the vehicle ready. One person inside, confronting Nancy, subduing her, moving her toward the door. Then both working together to carry her the final distance from door to vehicle. That division of labor would be efficient, would reduce the time required, would explain how 16 minutes was sufficient to complete everything that needed to happen, and would explain the controlled nature of the blood evidence showing purposeful movement rather than chaotic panic. Let's talk about what investigators can do with blood evidence from inside Nancy's home. Every droplet of blood can be documented photographically, showing its exact location, its size, its shape. That documentation creates a map of Nancy's movement through the house. Investigators can stand at each blood location and look around, understanding what Nancy would have seen from that position, what was within reach, what paths were available from that spot. That helps reconstruct not just where Nancy moved, but potentially why she moved in that direction. Was she being pushed or pulled toward the door? Was she trying to move toward a phone to call for help? Was she disoriented and moving without clear purpose? The blood trail answers some of those questions. Each blood droplet can also be collected and tested. DNA testing confirms it's Nancy's blood, which has been done. But more sophisticated testing can determine other information. The presence of saliva mixed with blood might indicate Nancy was hit in the mouth or nose area. The presence of certain proteins in the blood can indicate how long it was there, helping establish timeline. The presence of transfer patterns where blood was touched or stepped in can reveal where the person who took Nancy walked, what surfaces they touched, potentially leaving their DNA or fingerprints in the blood. All of that forensic analysis takes time but provides investigators with detailed information about what happened. The blood evidence inside the house can also be compared to blood evidence outside. If the blood inside shows different characteristics than the blood on the porch, that could indicate Nancy sustained multiple injuries at different times during the 16 minutes. If the blood is consistent throughout, that indicates a single injury that bled continuously as Nancy was moved. Forensic experts can analyze the volume of blood based on the number and size of droplets and estimate the severity of injury. Significant blood loss would indicate serious injury. Minimal blood despite a visible trail would indicate relatively minor injury that bled externally but wasn't life-threatening. And all of that information helps investigators understand Nancy's condition when she left the property and whether she would have required medical attention immediately or could have survived for extended period without treatment. The disturbing reality that forensic experts face when analyzing cases like Nancy's is that blood evidence tells you what happened physically, but you have to imagine what the victim experienced psychologically. Nancy was in her own home, the place where she should be safest. She was asleep in her own bed when someone entered. She woke to a nightmare of confrontation and violence and injury. She bled as she was moved through rooms she knew, past furniture she'd owned for years, along hallways she'd walked thousands of times. She was taken out her front door, across her front porch where she'd greeted neighbors and received packages and lived her normal life. And then she was put in a vehicle and driven away from everything familiar. The blood evidence documents that journey. Documents that Nancy took that journey while bleeding, while injured, while aware of what was happening. And that awareness makes what Nancy experienced in those 16 minutes profoundly traumatic, even before considering what might have happened after she left the property. Former FBI agent Maureen O'Connell has said in interviews that one of the hardest parts of analyzing crime scenes is imagining what victims went through. The blood evidence is clinical and scientific. You can measure droplets and calculate trajectories and document patterns. But behind every droplet is a human being experiencing violence and terror and pain. Behind Nancy's blood trail through her home is an 84-year-old woman who lived peacefully for years being subjected to something incomprehensible. And that human element is what drives investigators to work cases long after media attention fades. That human element is what makes forensic experts examine evidence with such care, knowing that every detail might be the one that leads to justice for the victim. The blood evidence in Nancy's case is still being analyzed. DNA results take time. Forensic reconstruction takes time. Building a complete picture of exactly what happened in what sequence with what implements and by how many people takes extensive work. But the foundation of that work is the blood evidence inside the house. The droplets that mark Nancy's path from confrontation to removal. The pattern that tells investigators this was controlled and purposeful rather than chaotic and random. The location that tells us Nancy moved through her home while bleeding, while being taken, while experiencing something no one should have to experience in their own home where they should be safe. What investigators know from blood evidence inside Nancy's home is that this crime was personal in its violence even if it wasn't personal in its motive. Someone put hands on Nancy. Someone injured her enough to cause bleeding. Someone moved her bodily from inside to outside. Someone loaded her into a vehicle while she bled. That level of physical contact, that intimate violence, even if the motive was financial or opportunistic rather than personal grudge, creates evidence, creates DNA transfer, creates the possibility of fibers from clothing, creates the chance that whoever did this left something behind that can identify them. And if they left something behind in Nancy's blood, forensic analysts will find it. The blood inside Nancy's home also creates a scene that can be searched for other evidence beyond just the blood itself. The confrontation site where Nancy was injured is a location investigators can examine intensively. Did Nancy grab onto anything during the confrontation, leaving her DNA and possibly dislodging something from the offender? Did the offender drop anything, lose anything, leave anything behind during that confrontation? The path from confrontation site to front door can be examined. Are there signs of furniture being bumped into? Signs of walls being touched for support? Signs of struggle or resistance? The front door area can be examined. How was the door opened? How was the security gate dealt with? What marks or traces were left? All of this examination happens while following the blood trail because the blood marks the key locations. And at each key location, investigators can deploy their full toolkit of forensic techniques. Luminol to reveal blood that might have been wiped up or cleaned. Alternate light sources to reveal fingerprints or biological fluids. Chemical testing for trace evidence. All of it focused on the path marked by Nancy's blood through her own home. The blood evidence inside Nancy's home is disturbing because it reveals what Nancy experienced. But it's also hopeful because it creates a roadmap for investigation. It creates locations where evidence can be found. It creates connections between offender and victim that can be exploited to identify who did this. Blood evidence doesn't disappear. Blood evidence doesn't lie. And blood evidence in Nancy's case is telling a story that investigators can follow toward identifying the person or people responsible. True Crime Vault continues coverage of Nancy's case with expert forensic analysis. Subscribe and turn on all notifications for updates. Like this video to support investigative journalism that examines evidence in depth. Share this video because someone watching might have information. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 49 days. Her blood inside her home marks the path she was forced to take. And that evidence, combined with the work of forensic experts and dedicated investigators, will ultimately identify who took her and where she is. The blood inside Nancy Guthrie's home tells a story, a disturbing story, a story of violence and control and calculated abduction. But it's also a story that has an ending. An ending where forensic science and investigation converge on identification. An ending where Nancy is found and justice is served. The blood evidence guarantees it. Because blood evidence doesn't lie. Blood evidence persists. And blood evidence in Nancy's case is creating a trail that leads not just from inside her home to outside, but from the day she disappeared to the day those responsible are held accountable.